Marc-Claire Reillier, co-chair of Platform Leaders and Chief Operating Officer at Launchworks & Co. We've got a fantastic program for you. We're going to talk about generative AI, platform regulation, and the circular economy. But for those joining us for the first time, Platform Leaders brings together the different communities that are building the future of digital platforms. And that includes entrepreneurs, practitioners, policymakers, academics, and investors. So we are today collaborating with Katie Chappell, who will be live streaming the event. She will be capturing our speakers in action and will show you her progress throughout the event. So everything today is happening live. So you can interact and submit your questions, comments, reactions through the chat function, and the team will do their best to surface them at the relevant time. But now let's move on to what's in store for today. So we have 3 sessions, and then my co-chair, Benoît Reillier, will close the event. So we'll first start with our keynote on generative AI with Professor Geoff Parker. We'll then have a panel on platform regulation with renowned experts from Google, the European Consumer Organization, and the Competition and Markets Authority. And finally, we'll focus on the circular economy with experts from Farfetch and eBay, who will talk about how platforms can help with scaling the circular economy. But before we start, I'm very curious to find out what all of you have been working on. And so we've got a quick poll for you. What best describes you? I'll let you a few seconds answer now. Okay. Ooh, interesting. I think it shows that, there's actually a, wide range of people attending. Either they're working on a new idea, or they're working on an established business, or they're researching or teaching the platform economy, or involved in platform regulation, competition, or lawmaking. So, very balanced audience. That's great. But now we're going to move to our keynote of the day. And the question is, will generative AI augment or disrupt digital platforms? So generative AI has been in the news for a few months. It's a very powerful and disruptive technology. On one hand, you've got people like Goldman Sachs saying that Gen AI could raise global GDP by 7%. On the other hand, it could bring significant disruption to the job market, with 300 million jobs at risk. So that's 1/4 of current jobs. Others predict doom and gloom, almost like the end of the human race. So there's a wide range of scenarios, but one thing is sure, almost everyone is going to be impacted. So let me introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Geoff Parker. So Geoff is a professor of engineering at Dartmouth College. He's also a research fellow and visiting scholar at MIT's Initiative for the Digital Economy. Geoff is very well known in the field of platforms because he's one of the leading researchers and contributors to the field of network economics. And he's also the co-developer of the theory of two-sided markets. Geoff is also co-author of the award-winning book, Platform Revolution. If you haven't read it, you have to. It's a must read. Now, I think it's very fitting to have you here today, Geoff, because I didn't know until recently that Dartmouth is considered as the birthplace of AI as a research discipline, with the first AI conference organized in 1956. It dates a while. So Geoff, welcome.
Thank you so much, Laure. Thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure.
So, I mean, Gen AI tools can help us do new things, such as creating content, helping us code, analyzing large amounts of data. But let's focus on the creation of content because it applies to so many fields. The idea that you can produce very personalized content on a prompt is both exciting and very worrying at the same time. And it has implications for lots of existing platform businesses, hasn't it?
It really does. I mean, if you go back to the basic way that we think about platforms. We think of them as matching kind of two types of users, often a content side, often a consumer, but they come in lots of different flavors and multi-sided platforms. And the goal is to create a valuable transaction. And so a lot of the way that that happened or happens is you've got a thick supply side, if you will, and then a thick demand side, and then all kinds of technology that has data and it's sort of data-driven matching that then allows for the right supply to meet the right demand that creates the most value. Well, generative AI has the potential of turning that on its head. And it's not that the data isn't incredibly valuable, and we'll come to that, but the idea that you have to have a pre-existing sort of stable of supply, if you will, that you then sift through and match to the right demand, may well just disappear, at least for some types of industries where you can call forth exactly what you want or something that's potentially closer to your preferences than we've ever seen before. So it's as you say, both incredibly interesting and exciting, but also super disruptive. But then we've seen that for decades in the kind of rise of the platform economy writ large.
That's right, yes. So many of these new Gen AI tools, so ChatGPT, Bard, Claude, there are so many now. They are very powerful and easy to use. So I'd be very interested to do a quick poll with the audience and ask them how often do they use Gen AI tools. Robin, if we can pull the poll just to ask the audience really quickly whether they've used tools before. I'm sure most of you will have, but also do you use it for your work and or your personal life? And while people are answering, I can talk about my experience. I use it a lot in my work, but certainly on a personal level, I found that the Open Table plugin on ChatGPT is really incredibly efficient for finding a restaurant that fits my criteria. And it completely redefines matching. And actually for platform practitioners, the user experience for search is completely redefined. And also think that ChatGPT's wine pairing recommendations are amazing. I don't know now if we can see the results of the poll. Interesting. Yeah. So we've got almost 20% of people using it every day, with a bit less than 10% people that have embedded it in their daily routines. And people use it for work and life. So thank you very much for that. So I was wondering, are there any examples that you've seen on the ground with your students of how they use these tools today?
Absolutely. And, in many ways, these kind of GPTs and large language models have been around for some time, but they exploded, I think, into the public awareness really in late last fall, sort of November, December. So I teach a data analytics project lab class, and I essentially had to redesign the class, and that's on March, kind of April, May, to incorporate these things because it would have felt completely out of date in just 6 months. And that doesn't happen that often, that you just have to scrap significant amounts of your content. But if you think about sources, sort of application areas, website development, for example, you would expect people to become much more efficient using these tools, which then either means you're going to do a lot more for end users, or fewer people are going to be kind of in that machine kind of human loop. And so similarly with coding, I found myself, I have to sometimes create a set of graphics. I don't always remember the syntax. I used to say, well, did you Google that or go to Stack Overflow? Now you just go into one of the GPTs and if you want it in Python, say, do the following for me, and then it just pops up. That's sort of been my experience. But what we did with the students that I think is really a pretty cool project was one of the financial services firms commissioned, they sponsored a project And the prompt was, hey, we don't want people to have to go to our website to do things like pulling moving averages of stocks or looking at various indices, which is how you would do it now, but let's make that all voice activated. And so the students are not computer science students. They're smart kind of engineering and management kids. But they embraced it. So they figured out a tool that will take voice to text. And so then they had text, but they can't really pull financials. And so then they figured out how to do prompt engineering to train an LLM to take the text, transform that into the exact syntax so that you have all of your API keys embedded. And then it can go to something like a Bloomberg, a Yahoo Finance, a Vantage Point, whatever the source was, and then pull the exact numbers. And then within the Streamlit and Python environment, just create a nice, pretty graphics. And what was absolutely stunning to me or frightening was students within 4 or 5 weeks put together something that's like this close to production ready. I mean, okay, production ready is too strong, but in terms of a proof of concept, you could hand that off to a team and then they could embed it pretty quickly because all the moving parts worked. And with 250 lines of code, they called 3 major systems, embedded it, 2 different LLMs, and did the work that would have taken months, and did it in weeks. So I think that's just in a microcosm, kind of what's going on. And this is one of those areas where a lot of companies are super busy with their day-to-day. And I'm kind of used to almost being a follower on the data science side because companies have so much data and they're moving ahead. But this may be one of those sort of disequilibrium times where the students actually have a chance to play with this tech and can actually come in and bring some pretty new ideas and new capabilities. So I'm, as you can tell, I'm pretty enthusiastic. I think it's really fun.
Impressive. Now, you've researched network effects for many years, and you're one of the leading academics on the topic. So platforms derive incredible value from network effects, but in the world of generative AI, it seems that learning effects become much more important. So what's the difference between network effects and learning effects? And are network effects as relevant in a Gen AI world, or is it more about having the right kind of data going forward?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because if you kind of go and circle back to where we started about kind of the function of a platform. So the function being to create matches, to have valuable exchanges. And so great. That starts to get turned on its head because now if we can start to generate that, as we noticed earlier, you don't necessarily need to have pre-existing content to match to, but you still have to have a ton of data. I mean, these systems are trained on massive amounts of information, and you still need, people need help. So the idea that you and I are going to magically be really good at calling forth what we want is probably not true. So you can kind of see a different place for intermediaries to step in, whether they're automated or whether they're humans, to help create the content, if not necessarily a system to create the matching. But if you think about network effects, our kind of prior conceptualizations of that were they increase in the number of users, they increase in the number of participants. Now, of course, we're seeing data flow, or rather a lot of value flow to the data itself. So I think we are going to see a shift in sort of the locus of value creation in platforms.
Okay, and so what is likely to be the impact on existing platforms? Do you think they might
So,
benefit?
great question. There's a pivot, right?
Yes.
So I think the impact is they have to think carefully about the various sources of value that they're providing to their users. And when we talk about network effects, we often will divide that simplistically into 3 buckets. So bucket 1 is your product or service. What does it do if you were just playing with it by yourself? And so a lot of for example, social networks don't do much in the absence of other users. And so they don't have a lot of standalone value. But other things, tools like spreadsheets, have tremendous standalone value and a lot of kind of collaborative value, but not necessarily so much cross-site value. And so I think being really thoughtful about the sources of value in the system and how they're going to shift from embedded in the platform itself because it has access to data, to the collaborations that it provides, to the ecosystem connections, I would expect to see the relative fraction of value start to shift around a lot. It doesn't mean that the platforms are going away, but it means there's an adaptation coming up.
Interesting. So, I mean, Gen AI is likely to increase the productivity of many organizations, including platforms, in the sense that they're going to be able to do tomorrow what they do today more efficiently. But I suspect it will also create new markets. And we've seen, for example, marketplaces of prompts, connecting prompt engineers. That's kind of a new profession with clients. So what could be others?
Yeah, and by the way, I just thought, your example of prompt engineering as literally a market is so spot on. And we need Sherpas to help us, ask the right questions, and there's a market for that. So a couple of areas that you'd expect. So area one is you would expect to see sort of more interest in data sharing. So if you buy the premise that these systems need massive amounts of data to be trained on, and that creates value, great. That would suggest then either markets for data or data consortia and collaborations. And then fighting directly against that is, oh, wait a minute, that's all proprietary. And so now what we're going to see is actually a lot of closed sandboxes, if you will, where we're going to train these systems on proprietary data internally. Both of those are going to be forces that the platforms will have to reckon with, and they'll create new markets. So, market one is sort of more data oriented, collaboration, sharing. Market two is, okay, how do you actually set these things up internally and keep them safe? Very different, but and those are just two examples. I think we're going to see some growth.
A few days ago, Bill Gates, said that Gen AI will be so profound that it could radically alter user behaviors. And, he said something along the lines that whoever wins the personal agent will kind of win the game. With the personal agent, people won't need to go to a search site anymore. They won't need to go to a productivity site, or they won't have to go to Amazon again. So, I mean, that's quite extreme. But so could the world as we know it today be that different tomorrow?
So I'm going to merge a couple of streams together, but when I first saw these, I had that Mosaic moment. I remember 30 years ago when Mosaic was released, and I went home and I showed my wife, and I was like, look, this changes everything. She's like, she's an architect and tech savvy, but wasn't doing things like fetch and doing all of the SSH and file transfer protocols types of stuff that I was. And so it didn't really see it. But I said, what this technology is doing is it's taking a lot of existing things, and this is often how we see innovation working, and then integrating them to, in effect, create a new experience or dramatically reduce a transaction cost is really what happened with the web browsers. That's what I see here, is it's that fundamental. And you saw whole new industries rise, and you saw, lots of them just simply collapse because it no longer made sense. In terms of predicting that specific firms are going to just vanish from the face of the earth, maybe, but one could have said the same thing about Microsoft decades ago, when they were so slow to pivot to literally embedding any kind of internet connectivity. And yet here they are. So I wouldn't be so fast to write off the firms that are getting described there. What I would expect to see more is a really intentional set of pivots, and then adaptations to the sources of value creation.
So our next panel will be on platform regulation that was designed pre-Gen AI. Any thoughts on how these new Gen AI developments might need to be factored in?
Yeah, so, quite a few. I think one is literally thinking about access to data, who has rights to it. That's become even more important. The European Commission has actually done quite a bit of work in that area with both the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. Sort of full disclosure, we've been involved in sort of as panelists and commenting and trying to provide some feedback and improvements on those. So I think the data issue is an ownership and access, and making sure that there are rights to it, especially for those who contributed to the data sources, is one area that's kind of evergreen, if you will, on the regulatory space. The second is, I think this issue of deep fakes is both, fascinating, but absolutely creepy and scary. And I don't have a good answer on how to control that. So that's going to be one more that we just have to keep that issue front and center. And then a third one is fake information. I mean, being able to, and it kind of ties in with the deep fakes, but not knowing what's real is really problematic. And, we've already had a bunch of that. The disruption in our elections and our democratic processes, or just our social processes, I wouldn't see that slowing down. And so I think that both the firms themselves and the regulatory community have to work to understand the issues, and then, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good in terms of trying things to blunt the sort of malign forces while still harnessing what's good.
Okay. One final question, actually two, but we're running out of time. So there's one question from Adam Bartnikis asking, is AI more like disruption or adaptation for platforms? And
well, I think I could pretty strongly argue both. And I know that's, you don't want a two-sided economist, so on the one hand, on the other. I think it's very disruptive for those firms that can't pivot their business model or can't pivot how they think about their internal operations and their ecosystems and where value comes from. So that's the disruption. And then the augmentation is, if you think about who has the best data, it's the big platforms. And if you kind of buy the premise that, hey, this supercharges access to data, then you have to believe that they're in a really good position. So that's why you get this sort of on the one hand, on the other, which I know no one loves, but I think in this case it's accurate.
Okay, so thank you so much for your insights, Geoff. Just to close our discussion, if you had to encapsulate your vision in a few words and complete the sentence, the future of platforms is, what would it be?
Oh, I think the future of platforms is always adapting. It's unstable, but it never has been stable. And so I think we'll continue to see them make progress, particularly into traditional businesses, where sort of up the B2B and up the manufacturing supply chains, there's been tremendous sort of rigidity. I think that will continue, or even that change will accelerate. So I think nobody gets to ignore these forces, and that rate of change, or the timeline in having to ingest an understanding, and then honestly these tools into your sort of organizations and the way you create value, is just going to increase. So that's kind of what I see.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Geoff. It's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, Laure. That's been great. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you. So let me introduce the chair of our next panel, Richard Feasey. Richard is an inquiry chair at the Competition and Markets Authority and senior advisor at the Center on Regulation in Europe, where he researches digital policy. It was at Vodafone until 2013, having been its group policy director for 12 years, and has undertaken a variety of advisory roles since then. Richard, it's over to you now, and I'll let you introduce the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and good afternoon, everybody. So Laura's introduced me. My job is to chair this panel, introduce our distinguished panelists. We have Vanessa Turner. Welcome, Vanessa, who is the head of competition at BEUC, which, for those of you who don't know, speaks on behalf of consumer bodies and consumers in Europe. We have Oliver Bethell, who's I'm sure known to many of you, who is the head of competition, director of competition for Europe and EMEA at Google. Welcome, Oliver. And we have Euan MacMillan, who is a director at the Competition and Markets Authority at the Digital Markets Unit, which I'm sure we'll just come on to discuss a bit more later. So the way we'll run this is each of the panelists will make a few opening remarks, and then we will get into some discussion in the panel, and then perhaps some questions at the end. The context here, I think, is that we've been talking about platform regulation or regulation of digital platforms for some of us for many years now, but it's actually sort of finally arrived, and we're moving from debate to action and execution and implementation. And so what we'll try and get at in this panel is a sense of what, from different perspectives, from companies, from regulators, and from the consumer's point of view, what people are focusing on, what are the priorities, what are some of the challenges they anticipate, and what are their expectations and aspirations in terms of what platform regulation as it rolls forward, both in the United Kingdom and in Europe, and perhaps elsewhere as well in the coming years. What are we likely to see? Perhaps I could start, Vanessa, and ask you if you have a few introductory comments to make.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you also to platform leaders for inviting consumer representatives to participate today. So from the consumer perspective, I think we are seeing a new regulatory paradigm emerging for platforms and digital markets, certainly in Europe, in the EU, where I work with the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, the DSA, the Digital Services Act, the Data Act, the AI Act, the Data Governance Act, and so on. And there are more, but I won't list them all. But also at national level, including in the UK. And we may see this develop in other parts of the world too, such as Australia, Asia, and maybe even the US, perhaps more likely at state than federal level, but we will see. So tech companies have brought us a lot of good things as consumers, but also some much less good things. Therefore, such regulation is essential for society and to ensure trust and consumer choice. So regulation is coming, or as Richard just said, is actually already partly here. And there may be some differences in approach, as is the case, for example, between the EU's Digital Markets Act, DMA, and the currently proposed UK equivalent. And let's see whether the DMA and other EU regulation has the kind of Brussels effect we've seen for other legislation in the digital world. But as we'll cover that particular issue shortly, I'm going to park that for now and mention what we, from the consumer perspective, see as a key issue in this new platform regulation landscape. And that is whether this new regulation can be effectively enforced in practice to realize the intended benefits for platform users, whether businesses or consumers. And to my mind, this will require a number of elements to be successful, and I'm only going to focus on three. First of all, given the information asymmetry between the regulators and the regulated, for successful enforcement, it will be necessary to ensure that the regulators have sufficient resources and the right kind of resources to do their job effectively. I think the jury is still out on this in the case of the European Commission, and possibly the CMA or DMU might be in a better position. Also, to reduce information asymmetries, I think it's going to be essential to involve third parties in the implementation and enforcement of platform regulation. And by third parties, I mean business and consumers or other civil society organisations. The EU DMA foresees this in principle, but how it will play out in practice is yet to be seen. The situation for other regulations, such as the Digital Services Act, is more complex, as enforcement is primarily in the member states rather than with the European Commission. The draft UK regime involves public consultation, from what I've seen, on CMA DMU decisions, and perhaps Euan can explain or can expand a bit on that, what it might mean in practice. So that's my first essential point. The second one is that consumers will need to be able to effectively enforce their rights under platform regulation through collective redress or class action regimes, however you want to call it. The inequality of arms between tech companies and individual consumers makes individual actions very difficult. And the DMA, unlike EU competition law, provides for collective redress as a result of the inclusion of the DMA and, in fact, the DSA and potentially some of the other EU regulation that I mentioned earlier, and provides that that can be included or is included within the Representative Actions Directive, which is due to come into force this month. That's good news for consumers because it should enable collective actions if platforms fail to comply with regulation. I think in the UK, the situation seems to be the other way around with better options under competition law currently, but let's see how that pans out. So then my final point for effective enforcement is that for this multitude of platform regulation to work well, coordination between different regulators will be essential to ensure consistency and coherence, to avoid turf wars and enforcement gaps and forum shopping. And I think that means coordination of enforcement between competition, consumer, data protection regulators and the enforcement of the various laws if they're not within the same body, but also means coordination internationally. So in a nutshell, getting the law to regulate platforms right is only step one. We must also focus on effective enforcement of the law.
Great. Thank you, Vanessa. We'll come back, I'm sure, as you say, to some of those points as we get into the discussion. Oliver.
Thanks a lot, Richard, and thanks for having me here. So I guess a couple of observations from Google on how we're thinking about these new regulations. I think that particularly when we look at comparison between the Digital Markets Act and the UK bill, I think there are some areas of similarity and some areas of difference for sure. And when we compare these pieces of legislation, I think with other new forms of competition legislation, you identify similar similarities and differences. And I think when it comes to the objectives of the legislation, it's often not that difficult to see that we're headed in the same direction. We're looking for fair processes. This is not about a particular outcome that the legislator has in mind, but there's a particular way of ensuring that there's a fair, level playing field where everyone can compete on the merits. So there's a shared goal, I think, even when you compare existing competition rules and some of the new legislation that we're seeing today. What is changing for sure is the way in which we will need to be thinking about the practical application of this legislation, the rules that are meant to get to that particular outcome, the fairer markets. The application internally will change, I think, for us at Google. So too, the ways in which we interact with regulators will have to evolve. And I think Vanessa's already nodded to a couple of ways in which we will be responsible for ensuring that that's effective. So on the internal facing part of the process, when we look at the DMA, the list of core platform services, articles 5 through 7, so too when you look at the notion of designated activity conduct requirements, what you're really setting out there is a roadmap of quite specific types of product changes, things that you expect to see manifesting within Google, within the companies that are subject to the new rules. And what that is really starting to mean for us, it's been taking place for some years actually, to be quite frank with you all, is very much a shift away from a model where legal sort of sits as a check and balance at the end of a product development process, to legal needing to be, competition legal needing to be very closely intertwined with product decisions as they're being taken day to day. There's much more of an ethos now within Google to be engineering for compliance. That is an attribute you need to be considering when you're very early in the process, deciding which particular route to take when you're trying to build a new feature or innovation. So that, I think, is something that's new. Similarly, with the external facing part of our practice, you can't really hope to successfully, pragmatically, quickly come to compliance and reduce your regulatory overhead if you're not prepared to be very fast and quick and evidence-led in your discussions with agencies who are building out these new types of tools. That is very, very clear to me personally and to Google as a company. If you intend to find solutions that are practicable, that are reasonable, that are informed by how the products actually work, products that are obviously, I mean, AI is a great example of this, the speed with which some of these things are evolving absolutely requires quick and early engagement with the agency. So I think that's another feature of the new legislation and how we expect it will affect the practice. At its core, really is a desire across what is, you know, putting to one side some of the other pieces of legislation that Vanessa nodded to. If you just focus on the 22 or so rules within the DMA, you take that together with potential designated activities within the UK, there's an awful lot of ground to cover across different product areas within the company. And the one message that I receive repeatedly and have been receiving since, you know, early 2022 is get us the information that helps us understand what we need to do. That is what's most important to us. We are not interested in long, protracted, drawn out litigations. We want to understand how the rules should apply. We want the people who are giving that view to have a good understanding of how we build the products and how they work. We want them to understand the tools that we have at our disposal when it comes to testing and understanding the impacts of the services that we're launching. But that really is the overriding message that I hear from people internally now is engage, understand, and find solutions. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Oliver. Very clear. I think we'll come back to some of that as well. Euan.
Thank you, Richard, and good afternoon to everyone, to other panelists and the 94 people I can see that are on the call. Both Vanessa and Oliver did such a fantastic job at introducing there and made quite a lot of the same points that I was going to make. But perhaps what I'll quickly do is introduce myself and the digital markets unit and then respond actually to, I think, the 3 framing points that Vanessa made, which I think is a really useful frame for the conversation. So I'm a director in the digital markets unit within the Competition Markets Authority. We are in the DMU in what we call shadow form, as we're waiting on legislation to put us on a statutory footing. That legislation is the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Bill that was introduced into Parliament in April. It's moving pretty rapidly through the process, so we've had second reading already, and the committee stage will be next week when there'll be evidence sessions with parliamentarians. This is focused on competition and consumer laws. The question that I think you put, Richard, earlier to us was, is there a paradigm shift in regulation for platforms? And clearly that is, I think, evidently true, not only with respect to competition issues, but also things like online safety and data bills, which are also going through the UK Parliament. This bill, as Oliver said, is very similar in intent to the Digital Markets Act, and from a sort of external perspective is actually really quite similar in the approach that it's taking. There are some nuances that are differences in the approach between the 2 bills. But we are basically trying to designate particular firms, a small handful of firms, as having strategic market status in particular digital activities, where they have substantial and entrenched market power, giving them a strategic position in the UK market, and obviously equivalently the DMA in the EU market. That will then allow us to impose ex-ante behavioural constraints on those companies to open up the markets to competitors, but also where competition isn't practical, to be able to constrain behaviour in the best interests of people, businesses, and the economy. So we're going through the parliamentary process. We're a little bit behind the EU. This is a paradigm shift across the world, as we mentioned. When the UK held the G7 presidency in 2021, we kickstarted some work on coordinating with other competition authorities so that we were all comparing notes on what we were doing. And OECD took this forward alongside subsequent G7 presidencies, the Germans and the Japanese. And it's clear that there are a lot of jurisdictions thinking through this. EU, obviously, but also Australia has similar proposals. Japan, Germany at national level, and as Vanessa mentioned, in the US. It's important that we get the law right, but I think those three things that Vanessa touched on are really important. So the resources, the participative approach involving other parties, and then the coordination. And maybe if I could just very quickly run through those. Very happy, obviously, that Vanessa mentioned resources for regulators. It's great if we could have as much resources as possible. And it behooves me to mention that we are recruiting at the minute. So we have 20 positions open. So anyone on the call interested, please reach through LinkedIn. I would get my knuckles wrapped if I didn't mention that. But this, we hope, will be the first wave of recruitment of an additional uplift in resources as we expect the bill to get to Royal Assent. Then involving third parties. So the participative approach is something that right through the genesis of this legislation, we in government have been very clear, something that we want to do. We will be issuing guidance for consultation once we have Royal Assent. And that will be, once the Royal Assent has happened, the bill is in position, we'll have the ability to consult in the guidance that will be outlining how we will take forward the regime. We will then be consulting on the designations that we will launch. We'll have a 9-month investigation process for each designation, when we will expect input from consumer organisations, businesses, industry representatives, and of course the companies themselves. The conduct requirements that we will impose, we would also be consulting for them, and then we'd be consulting on enforcement issues as well as any further interventions that we needed to make. So we genuinely want to have that participative approach when we are hearing from all. And this actually links to the last point in coordination globally. I think that is absolutely key. We certainly, and our CEO and chair have been clear in Parliament on this, we do not want to diverge for the sake of diverging. Clearly, from Oliver's perspective, having a proliferation of different approaches is not good. And there shouldn't be any unnecessary, to borrow a term from the trade world, spaghetti bowl effects of overlapping regulations that are slightly different in different jurisdictions just for the sake of it. So I think it is important that we coordinate to minimize those issues, albeit we each do have our own jurisdictions and we have to come up with the best solutions for those jurisdictions. But a really good example I would point to is the work that Google and CMA are doing collectively just now on the privacy sandbox work. So this is Google's changes to third-party cookies. And we were concerned, as were others in the industry, that this could have a detrimental effect on Google's competition. And so Google and us are working together to ensure that that isn't the case, with a third-party monitor and in consultation with industry. And Google have committed that what they do with respect to our work will be rolled out globally. And we are consulting with other national competition authorities to make them aware of what's happening there as well, which I think is a fantastic example of what we can do. And that's the kind of ethos that I think we would like to continue as we move forward with these regimes. I'll stop there, but kudos to Vanessa for, I think, what was an excellent way of framing the debate.
Well, thank you all. And let's get into it a bit in terms of all of you have talked a bit about the what I might call the engagement process. So the way in which the interactions between not only the companies that might be regulated, but also other parties that might be affected by the regulation and between them and the regulator, and perhaps also with each other. So I've probably got a question for each of you, and Euan, perhaps if I can start with you. It's likely that, at least in my sort of observation of this, that different companies will adopt different strategies. I mean, Oliver, I think, has been pretty clear about how he thinks about engagement in this process and managing, some of the issues that Google faces. But it appears, at least from the outside, that other firms might be taking slightly different approaches. How does a regulator who has to design a set of processes to deal with everybody, how do you think about that issue that different companies here may come at you in very different ways with very different approaches?
That's an excellent question, Richard, and I'm not going to pretend that it's an easy one that I've got an easy answer for. We are as we've described, experiencing a paradigm shift in regulation. And the paradigm to date has been one of ex post enforcement, which leads naturally to large companies getting involved in a pugilistic litigation battle. And there's an interface between companies and regulators that is a buffer of lawyers. That is something that we want to change. That we want to inculcate a culture of compliance, a culture of forward-looking and joint working. I think the privacy sandbox example is a good one. Obviously, that is one that has occurred where it's been a commitment that Google has made under a Competition Act case. Compelling Google to have done that would have been a different story altogether. And ultimately, under the new bill, we will have the power to compel people to work with us. We'll be able to trial remedies and iterate them over time. I'd like to think that it's evident that we are genuine in our ethos of wanting to engage with companies to iterate, to develop things conjunctively as well as with stakeholders. And I would also hope that these companies would recognize that it is in their own interests to do so, particularly when we are given these new powers to impose conduct requirements. We want to get them right. And the best way for those companies to make sure that they are right is to engage early on in the process, openly, transparently with us and other stakeholders to make sure that nothing untoward happens. So I would like to think that incentives are aligned once the new powers have been granted by our Parliament.
Is it too early to ask you whether that's been your experience to date, or you're expecting that engagement really to start after the formal powers have been adopted?
So look, we engage with stakeholders, both the prospective SMS or strategic market status firms, and stakeholders who are challenger tech, I would say dependent tech, consumer organizations, etc. So we've had pretty good engagement, but this is all within the context of a bill that is going into Parliament. Different companies have different views on that bill. We haven't got into the specifics with companies of who's going to be designated for what and what the conduct requirements are going to be. It would be inappropriate to do so at this time. It would be preempting the due process that we need to follow. So I would expect that today is not necessarily a good guide for tomorrow once the bill has been introduced. That marks a change, and I think at that point it's clearly in all of the companies' interests to engage with us, and we'll be fully willing to do so.
Thanks. Oliver, I mean, you talked very clearly about your experience, certainly with CMA and also perhaps more broadly, and I wondered whether, and your approach, I wondered, how you'd experience the other side. So do you think that, because what we're doing here is seeing regulation, if you like, this participatory approach, or however you want to label it, emerging out of competition authorities that traditionally are accustomed to engaging with parties in a rather different way. And I wondered, just on your experience, how you think that's going, whether there are still things that need to change or be improved on either side to make that process work better.
I mean, I think, look, I think there's sometimes the most banal stuff is usually the most useful. And when Vanessa and Euan both mentioned this question of resource, clearly that's important. When you're, I mean, I think people have perhaps a perception that within Google we have limitless resources. I can tell you, if you're trying to ask for engineering time at the moment to work with regulators and those engineers are working on AI, that is not a straightforward conversation. But I think on both sides of this, there is definitely a need to make sure that you have the right people available and engaged to have the kinds of quite technical conversations. It's not impossibly technical. Sometimes there's another myth, perhaps, that all of these things are impossible to ever understand. No, that's not the case. You can understand how search works by getting reasonable computer scientists from within Google and from outside of Google together to understand this. It's not impossible, but it does take time and it does take resource. And on my side, that means making sure that I am not working through, this is how we're now organized, I'm not working through layers of legal managers to get access to product teams. I go directly to senior vice presidents within the company to explain that I have an opportunity to talk to the CMA about this technical issue that you care a lot about. Come with me. So you try and open those channels and make sure that people have the time and capacity to engage as early as possible. And then I think on the agency side, the regulator side, we're very happy when we see teams being staffed up with, it's great to see lawyers and it's great to see economists, but these days it's even better to see computer scientists, to have people who have a behavioral UX background. Those are the kinds of people, because when you see people staffing up in those ways, I think that first of all, they start to speak a common language with the type of people that I'm trying to introduce to those conversations. But it's also very reassuring. I think you can trust more in a process like Privacy Sandbox when there are technical people discussing technical options for addressing quite difficult and complicated technical problems. So I think that's one of the places where continuing to invest is sensible for us and for the regulators. I'm very supportive of that in both cases. The other place is a bit softer, but I think it's important, and it's something I focus a lot on internally, and it is about creating an ethos of trust and a willingness to take chances with new regulations and new regulatory teams. I think that you need that within Google, and you need that on the side of the agency. On my side, it means persuading people that with risk comes the opportunity to perhaps move quicker through this regulatory environment. It perhaps means that you're going to learn things about product ideas that you didn't think were possible, but are actually quite reasonable and have been sounded out with other people. And you may also gain support, because we are not, here's the big spoiler for you all, Google's compliance is not going to satisfy everyone, clearly. So in cases where that dissatisfaction is not really borne out by the facts, by the evidence, and that does happen from time to time, then the trust in the process, the trust in the regulator, the trust in those technical teams can sometimes mean that you can rely on those people to support you, to say, well, no, this complaint, no, this is not. Google's done its best. This is not what the law is designed to do. And I'm afraid this is not the right piece of legislation for you to use if you have an issue. There may be some other rule that you can rely on, or perhaps this is a commercial dispute you need to figure out with Google. So I think those are the two places for me, Richard. I think there's the day-to-day of investment in the people, the right people, getting them in the room for both sides of these debates, but also trying to create that environment of trust on my side. And of course, what you see delivered from some of these conversations from Sandbox and all of the children of Sandbox, if you like, that will be how we demonstrate that the trust has been worthwhile, that the trade-offs have made sense.
Thanks. Just one other question. A participatory model that takes in the views, seeks to capture the views of everybody and everybody's in the process might raise concerns that it just takes longer, it's slower. And you made the point, I think, that this market's moving very fast, and one of the motivations for this regulatory framework is that previous attempts to deal with those issues proved too slow. And is there a trade-off between sort of participation and agility?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. It's something that is very much front of mind for us. I take Vanessa's points earlier on, the importance of ensuring that there are litigation opportunities. And I think there's a very valid point. I think perhaps not without any constraints or filters, because the more people who are involved in the enforcement of the DMA, for example, the more we will see of that kind of stuff, and the more you tilt into that litigious world, I think, which is unhelpful. That being said, of course, you can't negotiate a solution for a consumer-facing, very significant product like search without hearing the views of consumers who are going to be using search. Of course, you need to have, those voices need to have they need to have a seat at the table from the very beginning of any of the kinds of solutions that you might conceive of there. So look, I've been thinking about it a lot. I tend to think that if you accept that you can't have everyone in the room, but it also can't be a private bilateral. In between, there are probably opportunities for a greater transparency about the nature of the problem that you're trying to address, greater transparency about the nature of the evidence that you're relying on to pursue a particular solution, and a willingness to not close the door on iteration. Right? At Google, whenever we launch products, quite apart from regulatory solutions, we think about, launch and iterate, launch and iterate. What's the feedback? What are the metrics showing? And I think that can absolutely work. It's probably the most appropriate framework for thinking about regulatory design, and you're having these kinds of engagements, so that if Vanessa has a new body of evidence that we haven't considered 6 months into a remedy that's just been launched, well, why would you not kind of think and be flexible and accept that you don't have to get it all right immediately? So I think with those kinds of safeguards, you can probably strike a bit of a balance. I mean, there will always be someone outside the room who wishes they were in, and there may be someone is in the room who shouldn't be there, and you'll have to deal with that a little bit. But hopefully with that transparency, you can reassure a lot of people that if they weren't there, then the right things were being done.
Yeah, yeah. Vanessa, perhaps we can come back to you. I mean, what you made a very powerful case for making sure that particularly the consumer voices in the room, from the outset, and I wondered. I mean, there are two models for that potentially. One is that the regulator convenes parties in a room and there's discussion with the regulator in the room. But the other is that the regulated firms have a dialogue themselves directly with consumers or with consumer representatives, before anything even gets in front of the regulator, if you like. And I wondered just whether you'd thought about that, what your expectations are, around what it is the firms themselves will do, as opposed to perhaps what you expect the regulators to do.
Thanks. I think that's a really interesting question. But maybe before I turn to that, just wanted to pick up on some of the things that you and Ollie said, which I very much welcome. It's very good to hear that there is no intention to go into a long, drawn-out litigation process on these issues. And you, Richard, mentioned whether participatory approach might actually be too slow. I think it can also be quicker, because we know on certain issues that litigation can go on for years and years and years. I think Ollie and I can think of a case which has gone on for more than 10 years. So that's not an ideal situation in a fast-moving market. So in that sense, dialogue, I think, to come back to your question, is a really important approach to try. And I agree that litigation also from the consumer perspective is not the ideal ways. So I think one would only use that if one can't sort things out in discussion, for the same reason that I mentioned before about the length of time of that. But it needs to be a backstop for consumers to have that option if things are not going as they should. But then on whether it makes sense to talk bilaterally to regulators or to companies directly, I think I have a kind of open mind on that. Let's test it out and see what happens. And I think it will also partly depend on a point that Euan made, and that is like the mindset of platforms. I mean, is there a willingness, as Ollie said, to really engage and to look at what other parties can bring by way of evidence, and is there a kind of genuine engage to comply not only with say, I mean, to use a not very scientifically term, the letter of the law, or to engage with what the law is actually trying to achieve, and in that regard, one of the things I think is going to be very important, and actually Ollie touched on it as well, that's the issue of how the regulation also deals with behavioral aspects or UX design aspects. I mean, is there a willingness to recognize that platforms should not be trying to circumvent the obligations under whichever regime through the use of kind of user interface design, online choice architecture to circumvent the rights that are given to consumers on that. I mean, if there is a willingness to engage, I think consumers, I mean, just speaking personally, I think then consumers would be very happy to engage to get the right results that works to everyone's advantage.
I mean, I suppose let me see what you think of this. There's potentially a benefit in encouraging platforms to proactively consult, you know, very early on in the process with consumer interests and other affected parties, in a sense, to anticipate problems that might otherwise have to get fixed later on downstream in the regulatory process itself. So I just wonder whether there might be an efficiency gain as well if consumers were brought in early. But then there's obviously the question of how do you have any thoughts on how would that be BEUC and the consumer organizations, or is there some other way in which you think the consumer voice should be brought in? Surveys, or I don't know. Any thoughts on how practically is that view fed into the process?
Also an interesting question. I mean, I can only really speak for BEUC, and certainly we're always open to listen to what companies have to say, whichever whether they're business users of platforms or platforms themselves, and to engage in that way. Surveys might be an interesting way to go, but I think it depends on how you do the survey. I mean, surveys can be done in a good way and they can be done in a less good way. So I think that has to be seen cautiously. I can't speak for other consumer organizations, but perhaps, you know, broadening it out beyond consumers, other civil society organizations are also interested in this debate. Digital rights organizations, for example, freedom of speech organizations, and the like. And I think they may have a point of view to bring as well on some of the issues that are at play here. I mean, particularly sort of in the data protection type sphere, but not only.
We don't have a huge amount of time left. We've got a few more minutes. I mean, what I think would be helpful from each of you, perhaps if we start with Euan and then Oliver and then you Vanessa, is, and then I have to ask you the question at the end about the future of platforms being ... But it is, you know, just from where your vantage point at the moment, because each of you are in different, you know, clearly at different points in this on the compass. You know, what is your what do you see as the biggest challenge at the moment? What is the aspect of moving from where we are today to where we're going to be in 5 years' time? What is the issue that is most preoccupying you and most concerning you? I mean, getting some legislation, Euan, I guess, is obviously sort of step one on that. But assuming that happens, what do you anticipate being? Is it getting resources? You know, getting the right data scientists? Is it? Any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. So yes, I was absolutely going to say that getting legislation through would be my biggest concern at the minute. I think it is important to reflect on the data scientists' point. So it's something that Oliver raised as well. So in the CMA, we have a data analytics, data technology and analytics unit that services different teams across the CMA, in particular the digital markets unit. And therein we have behavioral scientists, we have computer scientists, we have data scientists. And I should mention as well that I'm in a job share, and I'm an economist, sorry, but my job share partner is a behavioral scientist. And so that's something that we are taking very seriously, is incorporating that skill set into the organization. Now, we're not the only ones hiring in this space, and I'm pretty sure that Oliver's hiring some of those people as well. So we might be competing in the same field. So I think probably collectively we want there to be more resources to facilitate this exchange between industry and government. So I think that is a fair challenge. The thing that will immediately be in my attention once we get to Royal Assent is going into consultation on the guidance and really getting industry views and how we shape the actual practical implementation of the regime. And things such as you were mentioning there, is it surveys? Do we have particular groupings, roundtables? We need to figure that out. And it's probably no one size fits all model, but it's something that we'll want to hear about that from industry and stakeholders themselves, about how would they like to best engage with the regime so that we can make this a reality. So lots of things.
And if you think yourself forward and sort of, you know, think about what the future of platform regulation will be in 5 years' time in a sentence? Do you have a vision?
A constructive, healthy relationship with governments.
Thanks. Oliver.
So the challenge, so the thing that I personally, I can't speak for the rest of Google, maybe one or two of my team, but I think a lot about is, as we take a sort of breath and jump off the diving board and take the approach that we're taking at Google to regulatory compliance, which is to be fast and engaged and see opportunities to innovate within that framework. That's very much the ethos at Google. I think there are probably three things that I'm hoping to see come back in the other direction from the regulators that we're working with. First of all, clarity. They get some courage to be able to give us clarity and give us clear direction. It's very easy to listen to Google and say, oh yes, perhaps this, perhaps that, or we'll talk to the market. I think clarity and being prepared, all the caveats will attach, but clarity in how the rules ought to apply to us, that's something I hope for and will help us accelerate, I think. Equanimity in the ways in which they look at what we are saying and what complainants are saying and what third parties are saying, and that kind of detachment that you hope for in a regulator who's not going to be buffeted by, you know, political goals or influential complainants, but will give us that feedback on the merits, whether we like it or not. I think we strive for that. And parity, you know, I think that is something that's been, you've touched on this, I think one of your questions, Richard. If we get to a point in this process where we see that the alternative, let's say, approach of holding back, resisting, keeping information on your side of the fence, litigating procedural points, if that approach allows you to continue to maintain a particular approach that we think is less open than ours, then that becomes difficult, clearly, for an in-house team. Well, it's much better their way, Ollie, is what will happen. So I hope that in the combination of clarity, equanimity, and parity, that's how I can show to people that it's worthwhile to participate.
Thanks, very clear. And you know, you're in a sentence, the regulation 5 years, or platform regulation 5 years from now.
I mean, I think, it's very, yes, it's always, it's tough, but it's fun. Look, I think that compliance, regulatory, 5 years from now, I think for Google, that it is still an opportunity to innovate. It's innovation in compliance. I think that for us is what we hope for. It doesn't have to be a thicket of restrictions and constraints. It can be an opportunity to move fast and to innovate if you understand the rules better than your competitor, right? I mean, that's the goal.
Super. Vanessa, you get the last word.
Thank you. In terms of what I would like to kind of see coming up would be good consumer-focused regulation, not just DMA, DSA, but also Data Act, and to pick up on the first speaker, also in relation to AI, where I think that is also going to raise some interesting questions and therefore needs to be brought into the picture in a future-proof ways. Secondly, I think coming back to my original point, making sure that this regulation actually works for consumers to generate more innovation and choice. And then if I fast forward to in 5 years' time, to answer your second question, I hope the same as Euan. And I would add one other thing to that. I hope that regulation will still be up to date then, and if not, that it has been updated so that we can continue to benefit from innovation, whether it's from bigger tech companies or smaller ones.
Terrific. Well, thank you to all our panelists. Very interesting session. I think just remains for me to hand back to Laure.
Thank you very much, Richard. And thank you to Oliver, Vanessa, and Euan for this discussion on this very important topic. So let's move to our next panel, Platforms and the Circular Economy. And this panel is going to be chaired by Elle Tucker. So Elle is a former newspaper and magazine features writer and advertising creative. She wrote for The Guardian and the BBC, commenting on health, society, sustainability, tech, and lifestyle. Elle is passionate about the potential of online platforms to help us live more sustainably. And so she now speaks, writes, and advises on gig and sharing economy models. And she recently published Thanks for Sharing, a practical, realistic, and funny guide to help us live through more affordable and sustainable lives. It's a really funny book, and I recommend it to anyone who hasn't read it yet. So Elle, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Laure. I didn't realize you were going to have my book handy, so that was lovely. Thank you. And thank you for the introduction. I am indeed passionate about this space. So I'm really delighted to be chairing this panel today because it is right up my street. How can platforms power the circular economy to build sustainable ecosystems? So I'm welcoming today Lucy Peacock. Welcome, Lucy. Here
Hello.
she is. Hi, Lucy. Lucy's head of pre-loved fashion at eBay. We're delighted to have you here on Platform Leaders today, Lucy. And I'm also joined by Tom Berry, who is Senior Director of Sustainable Business at Farfetch. Hi, Tom. Thanks for joining. We did see you pop up earlier, but only briefly. No, only briefly. That was great. Great to have you both here. And I just thought we could kick off really by letting you both speak for a couple of minutes about your individual companies that you work for. Most people on today will obviously know the name eBay. Farfetch also maybe, but perhaps not. So it'd be great to hear about you and your roles briefly. Lucy, can you kick off?
Yeah, no, sure. So yeah, I head up pre-loved fashion at eBay. My kind of background is kind of working in different fashion brands across the high street, mainly mainstream fashion. I came to eBay about 18 months ago, and we're a massive platform, global platform. Our biggest markets are the US, UK, and Germany. And we kind of work with over 250 brands to work with them to kind of embed circular business models and look at those economic benefits of business models so they can scale them for the future. We work with charities. We have over 1,400 charities on the platform, so really heavily in the charity sector, and do a lot of work of sharing information between business and charities, again to really kind of increase money that goes into some of the projects, some of the good projects that our charities are working on. And finally, we have a lot of like consumers selling, and then also small businesses. So we call them our SMB businesses, which could be like a bedroom. We've got our bedroom millionaires to kind of real kind of focused circularity business that are really driving it from that space. So yes, I work across a really wide range from small business, big brands, and then kind of consumer selling. Our mission at eBay is to really kind of scale and accelerate the circular economy. We have a big role in our impact and our scale, and how do we use our expertise that we have we've been doing this for about 10-15 years. How do we use that data to share with brands to work through business models that are effective, both from an economic point of view and environmental point of view, and kind of reduce waste. I think some of you might have known we're working lots on things like some of all the barriers of shopping secondhand, things like some people might have seen our authentication guarantee, which we've been working on, where consumers can guarantee the items that they're buying in the secondhand market. And other barriers are things like whether an item should be hygienically cleaned. So we're working on a lot of that, of how a customer makes sure that they get good quality secondhand inventory so that they change those behaviours. So lots of work within that kind of space as well. But yeah, lots of work at the moment in that space.
And I know, Lucy, you've also been involved in eBay's quite high profile collaborations with some TV shows that anyone joining from the UK will have seen recently, which is brilliant and really bringing some of this into the mainstream. Is it Love Island? Am I right?
Yeah, we've partnered with Love Island. We're just going into our 3rd series. Actually, it started a couple of days ago, and this is all about change. It's like with changing customer behaviours on secondhand fashion. The particular TV program, Love Island, is very focused around Gen Z, and it was all about fast fashion. And we changed that narrative to so that all the contestants on the show wore secondhand. And just the narrative throughout the partnership of what does secondhand mean, and what kind of what quality and value you can get from shopping those items.
Great. We'll look forward to hearing more about that.
Yeah.
Tom, let's hear from you. Let's hear a bit about Farfetch and your role at that brand.
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me today. I've been at Farfetch for about 5 years. I've worked in sustainability and business strategy roles for about 20 years now. And I joined Farfetch to start and set up their sustainability program. Farfetch, for those that don't know, are the global platform for the luxury industry. So we connect about 4 million active consumers globally with about 1,400 of the kind of world's best small shops, boutiques we call them, and brands directly in about 190 countries. And when I joined, we launched a mission which we call Positively Farfetch, which was because the whole exec at Farfetch didn't want to just be any platform. They wanted to be a platform for good. And for us, that was about enabling positive choices, positive actions amongst both the businesses and consumers that we serve and enable. So that's what I've been doing since I joined Farfetch. Part of that mission, that Positively Farfetch mission, is specifically around circularity. So we have 4 key pillars. One of them's on circularity, and the goal that we set ourselves there is to be more circular than linear by 2030. So to have 50% of our business in terms of units that we deal with being more circular than linear, which really means growing the number of units that we service, so that we either buy back from consumers or that we enable consumers to donate or repair or recycle, or potentially in the future rent. So we need to grow those service models, but also grow the proportion of the products that we're selling. We already sell millions of products globally. The proportion of those which are more circular, so they are upcycled products or pre-owned products.
Okay, so you've got a task on your hands, Tom.
There's a big goal to go after. We're public about how we're doing, and we've got a long way to go. So we report publicly every year, and
fantastic.
The new report's about to come out, but last time I reported it was at about 2%. So we've got to get to 50. So it's still a long way to go.
Okay, great. And just to briefly, you've got some experience with big brands outside of the platform world as well. I'm just interested to hear a couple of those, because I know that the audience might be interested.
Yeah, so I mainly spent my career working in kind of consumer goods, retail and consumer goods. So as a consultant, I worked for some of the big retailers in the UK, and then I went in-house to a company called Innocent Drinks for a while, now owned by Coke, and then joined Kimberly-Clark, so the brand owners of things like Kleenex and Huggies and Andrex. So yeah, kind of mainly spent my time in that consumer goods industry.
Great. Okay, so focusing now on our topic for today, I mean, really to sort of recap about where we are. I mean, most people would possibly associate marketplace platforms with consumption, linear consumption, and this linear model, as Laure has explained in the lovely intro to this panel on the website. Since the Industrial Revolution, this take, make, use, dispose model has been the dominating force in our economy. But what can platforms do to change that? And this is what we want to get into today. It's really interesting that we've got two panelists here with a focus on clothing, because obviously, this, it's particularly interesting to me. And I think a lot of our audience as well be interested to hear what you guys are doing, because I think quite often what happens in the fashion industry can lead the way. Now, really, I suppose, just to share your thoughts initially before we get into the nitty gritty about the circular economy. Lucy, I just wanted to turn to you in terms of eBay and the circular economy. Now, was this something that you dove into straight away in your job? The word circularity, I think it's used and overused as well. How much does it dominate your day-to-day job?
Yeah, I mean, it's when I got to the eBay, got into my role, this has been going, like, the second-hand market is kind of like, it's nearly, a big part of eBay, and has been there for a long time. From the second-hand typewriter, I think everyone always quotes how it started off. So that whole kind of selling what was in your home, or what's in your wardrobe, has been around for a long time for eBay. That part of our business is massively growing, and from anything, as I say, we talk about fashion. Obviously, I head up the pre-loved fashion side of things, but anything from refurb tech to home and garden, even kind of things like used bikes, everything in that kind of area is massively growing over new, which is really encouraging, especially with the changing in kind of mindset of getting consumers to shop a bit differently. Mm-hmm. I think the bit for me is, how do we there is a lot of work with businesses, I think, is the big opportunity. And there's a really big education piece where what is people's do businesses really understand the waste streams within their business, and it's kind of when you start probing and say, well, what about this, what happens to this part of your business, what happens to those kind of the garments, then it's kind of, then you really realize what that opportunity is. And I think so that's kind of one side. I think the other thing for me is, like, how does it work from a kind of a circular term, as you said, that feedback loop into the first-hand market. So how do you really understand that second market to make decisions about the first-hand market, to make sure that you kind of continue in that circular way of working? A lot of it is down to education, from what we see from the brands and consumers. But yeah, it's massively growing, and that education is improving, but still a long way to go.
Mm-hmm. And Tom, by contrast, maybe your role at Farfetch, maybe circularity was something that you sort of moved into, and in a way, is that something that was surprising for you, coming to work at a platform like that? Because not necessarily the case that these two would be seen to sit together comfortably.
Yeah, It felt relatively comfortable. I mean, Farfetch were already selling pre-owned by the time I got there. So they been selling pre-owned since 2010. So there's kind of inherently an opportunity there, just business opportunity in that space. And you could arguably call that part of the circular economy. Mm-hmm. I think broadly, like when I came in, if we're a platform for the luxury industry, we're enabling a whole industry in different ways. And if we want to make that a better industry, which is the idea around sustainable business, then one of the key challenges on the environmental side in fashion is the fact that production is going up and clothing utilization is going down. So the need for circularity, because it's an unsustainable trend in the industry, because effectively the industry is using increasing amounts of new resources to sell increasing amounts of new products, which are used less and less. And the whole idea of circular economy is you're using less new resources, using existing resources more and more. So it was a key thing, which I think, if we're a true platform for good in the industry, that we needed to tackle. And there were some really, in hindsight, I guess, really obvious opportunities for us. We have this growing pre-owned section of the website already. And then we have these 4 million active consumers who already, thanks to the likes of eBay championing this kind of thing for many years, are already starting to think about, oh, it'd be great to be able to clear out my wardrobe, or it'd be great to be able to trade in this item. I mean, lots of industries, it's pretty common. You know, if you think about the car industry and now even the tech industry, it's quite common to be able to trade these things in. So launching the services which we have, you know, we launched Farfetch Second Life, which is our resale service, and Farfetch Refresh, which is our wardrobe clear out service. It was, you know, they were tough to do, and it's been, you know, it's been tough to grow them and get traction behind them for a whole load of different reasons. But it was a kind of, it's an obvious way to align business priorities with the circular economy. And we had already started by having pre-owned on the platform. You know, it kind of felt quite natural in that way. But,
and
yeah.
would you agree, Lucy, that sort of platform business models align well with the principles of the circular economy? And going back to, you know, with our intro there, it's, you know, the idea initially, I suppose, with platforms, it was very much about linear. It was, you know, marketplaces were for selling. This was, you know, a kind of one-way traffic. But actually, the model itself, it does seem to align. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. We're seeing lots of things where, like, things like relisting, like once you've, you know, how do you, like, we're looking at lots of different customer experiences at the moment where someone might, you know, how do you have something, you know what's in your wardrobe, like a digital wardrobe, and then you might get an alert to say, you know, this item that you bought maybe 5 years ago is now selling for this. Why don't you resell it? So it's kind of like, then it's putting it in that circulation from a customer point of view. You're like, oh, I might need that money at the moment. So it's unlocking that. So you're benefiting that customer, getting something else in circulation, and then someone else might buy that versus buying something new. So absolutely, that platform allows that kind of that circulation of products, that relisting, that information transfer, and kind of all aspects of the circular economy, not just resale. There's massive opportunity in things like rental, which I think might come on to a second, and kind of recycling. So the whole of that end of life is really important to platforms.
It's a lovely image and an idea that the platform technology is almost like the motor, the you know, is powering that circular movement of things, isn't it? Because it's the technology behind it that's sort of powering up. And just before we get on to the next question, just to remind everyone that the questions from our audience are welcome as well. So do drop them into the chat as we go along. Talking about successful circular platforms and their impact, what do you look to when you're doing your job, Tom?
I think it's
Lucy. Is it
like
Lucy? Do you look to?
No, I mean, like, I think it's basically trying to understand what's going to work for you and your business model. Like, a kind of successful circular platform is not, you know, it's like saying what makes a successful business. There are loads of things which can make a successful business. It's more about saying, what are the things which we can do in the industry that we're in and in the model that we run, which will enable better behaviors in the customers that we serve. So, you know, for us, we, you know, talked about running a consumer offer of take back and wardrobe clear out, but because we built that for ourselves, we also service these 1,400 brands and retailers around the world. And so a natural extension to that, and something which we have acted on, is we purchased a business called Luxclusive a couple of years ago, and they are a B2B platform resale business. So we can now enable other businesses, so the boutiques which are on our platform, other retailers outside. So Luxclusive run the resale service for Selfridges. We can be a platform for resale for those businesses as well. And it worked with our business model because we already service brands and boutiques with the marketplace, but we also already service them with e-commerce solutions. You know, that's a big part of the Farfetch business. We run the e-commerce for companies like Harrods and Ferragamo and about 40 other brands around the world, and have, if it goes through with the Competition Markets Authority, we'll soon be running that for the kind of Richemont Group brands. So yeah, it was a really natural extension of our own business, and that's what will make something successful. There's loads of amazing startups in the kind of resale rental platform space, and they've all offer something really unique. And we work with a lot of them. You know, it's kind of they're great models. I've learned a lot from working with those startups, but it's always inherently about how can we plug that into the model we're trying to deliver.
You've got an interesting audience, obviously, you know, with the luxury goods. You know, are there particular ways that you've been able to sort of encourage that audience to embrace circular practices? Lucy touched on, you know, using TV shows where people would maybe normally wear fast fashion. You know, maybe that wouldn't work as well for your audience because there's a lot tied up in the actual sort of maybe purchase price and the designer name. What particular strategies have Farfetch used for that encouragement factor?
Yeah. So on the sale of secondhand goods, the approach we've taken is really highly curated items which you can't find anywhere else. So there's there's a number of different drivers for why people buy into pre-owned. There are a lot of people buy into it because it's often lower costs. We actually haven't targeted that market because we've kept it really high end and elevated deliberately, because we know that that's what our customers come to us to shop for, and that's worked really well for us. The pre-owned customer is actually a higher spending customer than our average Farfetch customer.
Really? Yeah.
And so that's in terms of sale of pre-owned. And then in terms of even the service to buy back, we deliberately made it a buy up front model because we know our customers want a really easy luxury experience. They don't want to have to list, wait for items to sell, negotiate on price. They just want a really simple service which reflects the investment that they've made in that quite high value piece. So we've deliberately structured the service and the model of resale that we're offering to meet our kind of customer needs.
And Lucy, sorry, Tom, I was interested to know what Lucy took from that and what contrast, but also what similarities there were with eBay's strategies for, you know, encouragement.
Yeah, I mean, I think trying to think give some more examples. I do think like the experience is just really paramount, especially because it's like single items. They're like, if you like, eBay has the most like so many like listings and an array of brands and sizing and different eras and everything else. The bit for us is like, how do you get that to a personalized experience of what that means for me or for you or whatever? So that's like a real challenge for us sometimes. Some people like to browse through it and have and like scroll and kind of that browsing experience. Some people have very specific needs of what they want to look for in the secondhand market. We need to make that really easy for customers to make sure they get what they want and in their kind of style they want. So I think there's kind of that element on it. Obviously, value is really important for the eBay customer. A lot of it we kind of tend to find that it comes to, it's all about price and value, and then it's sustainability. That's how people shop secondhand. So what we're doing a lot more of is playing into that sustainability space. So like, how do we, you know, what are those kind of, we call them nudge behaviors around, you know, at what point of their journey that they get that nudge to shop differently, or to have education on why circularity is good, or why you would buy secondhand. So I think they're all really important to change behaviors and encourage people to shop differently.
Great. And I mean, I couldn't be on here and not mention the sharing economy. So I just wanted to focus briefly on resale versus peer-to-peer rental in both of your experiences, because obviously, you know, Tom, there you've mentioned some exciting new startups coming through in resale, and obviously the same in peer-to-peer. So just really to touch on that, Tom, based on your experiences, what are the advantages and challenges of peer-to-peer versus resale? Obviously, Farfetch doesn't do any rental or peer-to-peer.
Yeah.
Does it seem like something that is on the other side?
Yeah, look, it's no, I think it's a great model for the people who are renting out, and for the people who are renting in those peer-to-peer models, they're getting the benefit of the kind of best price in the market, likely the best price in the market, just because they don't have, there's no other middleman in the kind of in the way, if you see what I mean. And it also allows customers in the kind of really high-end peer-to-peer rental markets, it allows customers to monetize the investment which they've made without having to relinquish ownership of the product. You know, they like it, they want to keep it, but they can monetize it. So there are kind of key benefits. Just for us, the challenges, I think, would just make it too hard to support it through our platform. And those challenges are partly in terms of the experience. So often with peer-to-peer, because the renters are not kind of professionals, you know, the kind of experience of the person who's renting isn't necessarily great. And then vice versa, you know, he's kind of dealing with the challenges of returns and damage, and that kind of it's harder, I guess, peer-to-peer, and that you accept that as a peer-to-peer customer or seller because you know you're getting the best price. But that's not, that kind of service level is not something which we would want to offer to customers, I think. And then secondly is just rental generally, when we've looked at it as a model, because we've looked quite hard at how and when we could do it, and the challenges are that like logistical challenges associated with it. So the fact that it is, you know, it's high intensity in terms of shipping and also cleaning, but also that it's actually quite a complex model to offer, because you can offer subscriptions, you can offer like pay-per use, you can offer different lengths of time of that pay-per use, the kind of the models around what you do if something is damaged or is kept for too long, or, you know, so there's just a multitude of different commercial choices which you have to make, which make it quite a complex thing. Like I love it. I'm always pleased to see the new startups in the space. I think it's a really exciting area for me. Rental and resale, like they actually are pretty close. You know, it's all just about length of time in which you're owning something.
Absolutely, just whether it's the same person or many people.
So it's not I think I'm sure someone cleverer than me will work out a way of bringing them together.
Well, I have seen a few very new platforms coming through where the item is really key. The way that you access it, there are several options, and you know, I'm interested to see how that idea evolves. Maybe Lucy, the idea that you see something on eBay and you've got that option to rent it instead of buy it, or you can resell or rent it out. I don't know, is it something that's ever in discussion around the table at eBay, or is it just, as Tom say, sort of fraught with difficulties?
No, I think we would never say never, kind of thing. I think as I kind of spent more time in this space, I feel like all the different elements of the circular economy need to link. So I don't think we could ever look at just at resale. Like obviously we have expertise in that, but how does it all link together? So we're doing a lot of work with rental companies at the moment where they do have end of life, where probably they don't want to rent it, a customer might not want to rent it, but actually they might want to buy it, or what's that end of life of renting, and does that go into resale, so then increase that longevity even further. I think, you know, we're doing some work with a recent acquisition of ours with the Vault in Australia. Like, is there a way that a brand has you can buy that item, or you can rent it, or you can resell it? Like, how does that all work as a whole experience for a fashion customer, and what does that look like? So I think there's lots of exciting bits in this space and how they all link together.
And that takes us back to the tech. It would need to be the platform that was powering that and enabling it, which is obviously key. So I mean, we've talked about challenges here, you know, when we're talking about implementing circular platforms, and how do you feel, Tom, that the challenges present themselves, and how do you address them at Farfetch particularly? They don't sound as complicated as the peer-to-peer challenges.
No, look, I think in some ways they are. Like, there's it's hard, as Lucy mentioned, that the individual nature of items in pre-owned is hard, just because you have single SKU listings, single size, single SKU listings quite often. So that makes it challenging just from a volume perspective. think the kind of costs and margins involved are hard. You know, it's sadly harder and harder in lots of the categories, which is why the solution for us has been to focus on the higher margin, easier categories initially, at least. So the resale model, which we run, the kind of buyback model, is we focus just on handbags to date, because a single size, they maintain their value, you know. So it just made sense. It was also the biggest selling category we had in pre-owned, so it's like it made a lot of sense for us as a so again, I think a solution is like focus where you know you can win, because it's about getting traction and scale, not about launching a PR. Like if you're a brand or a retailer, I would say don't do it for the kind of PR benefit of launching something in circularity, because like think really carefully about how it's going to be part of your business for long term. Why would you invest in it to make it grow? So we did a lot of that thinking. Another challenge is visibility. It's just hard. Like when customers are coming to a retailer, you know, on our marketplace, it's a retail front end. Customers coming to that, they come to shop. You know, they come to buy clothing basically, and that's what they're used to. So offering them a service of like, well, do you want to sell that? Actually jars a bit. You know, it's quite hard thing. I mean, that's probably not a challenge at eBay because people kind of know that it's two-sided in that way. But yeah, that has been a challenge. Like, how do you raise it? And again, the solution for us is just make it integrate, like make it obvious. So as I said, resale service focus on bags. If we're doing a bags edit for our shops, that's where we raise the profile of the resale service for bags, and it kind of works commercially for us as well.
Yeah, so sort of choose your moment, really, isn't it? Yeah. And Lucy, I just wanted to touch on, because I'm conscious of time, I wanted to touch on sort of policy and regulation, because obviously eBay is a big animal, and I just wondered how the policy and regulation can either support or actually, restrict what you're doing in terms of circularity.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, we're part of I'm part of the advisory board for Textiles 2030, where we kind of work with the government on like how to, what is legislation that will help in terms of really accelerating circularity. It is fundamental in like really changing behaviours, especially kind of there's obviously lots of work being done in EPR. What does that look like for the fashion industry? And it will change. It will just force brands to do something different. And at the moment, it's a bit of a nice to have. It's a pillar in the strategy. Yeah, I need to get to it at some point, kind of thing. But I'm still in this take, make, dispose mindset of how my business is made. That this fundamentally needs massive change in a business model to be circular. And as Tom said, like everyone within that business needs to be behind it, and I think legislation will help that, and kind of like change things for the consumer. However, I would also say that I don't know, that potentially could be a long way off, and I know Tom's got some great targets for 2030. I think like how do brands like get going now, because it's the learning. Each brand we work with, there's no one size fits all for circularity. Some brands will think one part of it is really important to them, others do different things. And how do those businesses learn now, get that data, understand what economics work? There's so much innovation in this space at the moment. It's unbelievable. Like I can't, even for the last 6 months, I feel like I'm trying to keep up with all this amazing stuff.
Yeah.
And in one sense, I'm really excited about all the different technology that's coming through, like generative AI and things like that will help this, people adopt the circular economy and accelerate it. However, we need everyone and that mindset in there to deliver change. But yeah, so it's kind of 100% legislation, but I think in the meantime, till that goes through, what can businesses do to really accelerate this?
There are two bits of legislation coming through which I think I'm really positive about. One is it's like a EU, they're both EU level. Like one is a directive for like minimum levels of recycled content within products, and a declaration of what recycled content is in products, so it has to be transparent to consumers, and they have to meet a minimum level. Like that, if that comes through, again, like from in terms of the levels of upcycling, recycling required within the industry, that could give it a huge boost. And a lot of companies are already doing that, but it will just raise the water level amongst all of them. And then the second is for the digital product passport legislation, which, you know, is an enabling technology. You know, it's just it's a way for consumers to access a digital version of a product. But it just, if that happens across all products, and if there is a good guidance around making sure that the underlying rules and technologies are all interoperable, then it massively enables people to access services in relation to the products they have. Services like pricing in the resale market, actually accessing resale services, accessing repair services, accessing even just like simple things like how you would clean your product effectively. Like it should, that piece of like enabling legislation should have a huge impact. It just depends on how it's if and when, and then how it's implemented. So
before I ask you for some closing remarks, I just wanted to jump to some of the questions from the audience, which we are up against it time-wise, but they are so interesting. I just wanted to quickly jump on those. Somebody's asked, do you measure the rebound effect? Are customers buying more in quantity because they buy cheaper or second hand? That's probably one for you, Lucy.
Yeah, we don't. I think it depends on the generation. And I think this is an ever evolving kind of market. I think what tends to happen sometimes for the Gen Z, they're quite used to this kind of fast fashion kind of like consumer model. And sometimes some of the platforms, things like Depop and Vinted and those, they kind of get into that second hand, like quite like increase, like, you know, a really frequent shopping experience. So sometimes it is, you know, that people do end up buying more or the same as what they would do for fast fashion. It's not really where we want to get to. So there is that side of things. I think like the digital passports is really, I think it's really exciting, because I think we can do a lot more measuring on how many times an item gets resold, and you'll have that data to really understand that kind of rebound effect. So I think that data piece is really important, how we understand things going forward.
Thanks. And just squeezed one more in, if that's okay, Laure. Somebody was asking, this is one for you, Tom. How's your business? You did touch on this. I just thought this could be just fleshed out a bit. How is your business handling end of life for products on your platforms? What happens to it when it can't be sold any longer?
Yeah, so I mean, it just goes to the resale market, which we don't deal with. Like, so another reseller who's willing to deal with those kind of products at that level of quality, or it goes recyclers or to charity. So kind of, and they will end up often in like, again, they're kind of either a mix of recycling streams and or resale streams at just a lower quality or lower price level.
Okay. Great. And I've just got time, I hope, Laure, to really kind of hopefully summarize how can obviously circular platforms help us transition. We've talked about the technology really just being the motor that powers these different ways of being circular, because as Lucy, you've talked about, it's not just about resell. Can we win this race against time is the big question. And really, I just wanted to turn to you, Lucy, and sort of ask if you had to sort of encapsulate the vision that you have for circularity powered by platforms like eBay. How would you sort of complete that sentence? The future of platforms is what, it's as hard as the one Richard gave his panelists at the end of the previous session, but how would you finish that sentence?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of I think it's what you were saying before, I see ourselves, or my vision is be that kind of heartbeat of the circular economy. How can we obviously have that accessibility to all different types of circular business models, and then also that sharing of knowledge and being that kind of form of education to help people think differently, or businesses to think differently around circularity and what does the fashion industry come to. So I think that heartbeat and that powering is going to be really key over the next couple of years.
Fantastic. And Tom, same question to you.
Yeah, I think broadly, any platform, like fashion or not fashion, I could have the chat on Google. Google are a platform, and they, every platform is an enabler. That's what they do. They enable other people or actors to do certain things, and you've got to take a choice as a platform as whether you want to enable more positive choices or better choices, which actually benefits people and the planet, or whether you don't care. And so as a platform, the kind of future of platforms is just about enabling better choices for people in the planet. They're the biggest issues that we face as a society, are social issues and environmental issues. They are the biggest things, and loads of businesses, the most exciting startups coming through, are deliberately orientating themselves around solving some of those problems. So if you're not thinking about it, you're missing out.
What an inspiring finish to this panel. Thank you so much, Tom and Lucy, for today's session. Laure, I'm going to hand back to you now. And look, we're only 2 or 3 minutes over, so I don't think I'll get told off.
This is perfect timing, Elle. Thank you so much. And thank you to you, to Tom and Lucy, for the super interesting discussion. So I'm now going to introduce our final speaker, Benoit Reillier, CEO of Launchworks & Co. and co-chair of Platform Leaders. Now, Benoit has the difficult task of wrapping up the event for you. So I'm now going to hand over to him. So over to you, Benoit.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Laure, and good afternoon, good morning, even good evening for some of you. So it's been a great event, really, and we had three great topics. We talked about Gen AI and the impact it has on existing organizations in general and platforms in particular. We talked about regulations, and everybody was talking about this emerging paradigm, new paradigm in Europe and beyond. And we just talked about the circular economy and how these platforms are increasingly powering sustainable ecosystems that are at the heart of the circular economy. And we used the example of fashion to illustrate that. So I'd just like to take a few minutes to reflect on these three topics. It's very difficult in our field now to have any conversation without talking about generative AI or Gen AI. And like Geoff Parker, I think many of us have had this mosaic moment, the first time you use a browser and you discover the web, and it's very much the same feeling when you realize what this technology can do. I mean, the breadth of capabilities and the speed at which actually these tools are evolving is quite incredible. So it was fascinating to hear Geoff and Laure discuss these innovations and the impact they're already having in the market. When we talk to our clients, we have a number of questions about Gen AI. I mean, one question is this real? Does it matter? And the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, it's a question we had at the beginning of the year. And if you're still asking yourself this question, I think the answer is yes, and you almost need to catch up. The other questions we have are about what's the impact on me? And that's a more difficult question, because some things will be easier, so there's a positive impact. Some things will be more difficult, so there's a negative impact in some other areas where you may have more competition, for example. So you really need to look at your business carefully. The way the technology will impact your business will also depend on how you're organized. Are you a platform, or are you a traditional value chain, or are you a mix, hybrid organization? So these things need to be looked at, and that's important. And for sure, there are very significant productivity gains to be had with these new technologies. But more importantly, the strategic question that needs to be asked is not just, how can I do what I've been doing for years more effectively? It's a necessary condition, and it's important to do that. But it's about what are the new things, what are the new products, the new markets, the new types of organizations that are enabled by this technology. And these are very interesting discussions, and we think many markets are going to be impacted, and many firms are going to be augmented, and that's the kind of conversation that we're having at the moment. The second topic was platform regulation, and the panel was titled "Platform Regulations at a Crossroad," and that's because there is a big shift, there is a big change. Platforms have always been subject to existing regulations, of course, but this is the first time regulations are designed specifically for platform businesses. And the European Commission and other countries have thought very hard about what that meant. And we talked about the DSA, Digital Services Act, the EMEA, the Digital Markets Act. We talked about the new regulatory unit in the UK, the DMU, Digital Market Unit, inside the CMA, the Competition Markets Authority. Lots of acronyms in this space, but basically that's important because some of these regulations will impact all the platform businesses, all types of platform businesses. So, for example, the DSA has got provisions that would force platforms in Europe to solve specific issues, to be transparent about algorithms. If your content is being moderated by a platform, for example, you now have a right to appeal and understand why the decision has been made, etc. So some of these regulations apply across the board, and some of these regulations are targeted at large established platforms, and they're about making sure that the market remains competitive. So when you're a large established platform, you may be tempted to keep people outside of your ecosystem, for example, some potential competitors maybe, and that will not be possible anymore. So practically, you may find that Apple has to open up its iPhone to third-party applications outside of its App Store. So before you had to be approved by Apple and go through the App Store, in the future, you will possibly be able to sideload applications as a result of these regulations. So very interesting time and very interesting discussion, because the UK, not being part of Europe anymore, has a slightly different regulatory framework, more flexible potentially, with bespoke codes of conduct that will apply to these large platforms with a strategic market status, as they're called in the UK, or gatekeepers in Europe, and that may give the UK some interesting flexibility, especially with all these new technologies. We talked about Gen AI. This is, of course, impacting the platform markets at an unprecedented speed. So interesting to see how this unfolds going forward. Now, the last topic really was about the circular economy and platforms powering the circular economy. And this is an increasing trend. More and more clients try to use platforms for good. And that was very interesting to listen to Tom talk about this shift from a linear mindset to a circular or ecosystemic mindset, and he wants his products to be, or the majority of his products to be circular, and the platforms, of course, are ideally positioned to enable that. So lots of interesting things. eBay, trying to reframe the debate and nudge Gen Z to go for pre-loved items instead of the fast fashion reflex that this generation may have. So very interesting to see that platforms have a big role to play in powering the circular economy. I love Tom's line about the future of platforms being about enabling better choices. So that's it. Thank you very much. I mean, it's great to bring together practitioners and policymakers and academics to have these conversations. So I'd like to thank all our speakers, all our panelists. I'd like to thank all the people who've helped make this event possible. So Robin Booth, Justin Coots, Stephanie Tarleson, of course, Laure Claire, who's been my co-chair today, and Katie Chappell, who's been illustrating in real time many of these debates. So thank you all for joining us today. We've got a big community. We're more than 1,500 people now. So thanks for participating, contributing on the chat, etc. Thank also to our sponsors. I mean, I'd like to thank Google for sponsoring this event, which allows us to keep the event free. And we look forward to seeing you later on this year. So we'll tell you more via email, but we are thinking about, of course, new events and offline and online. So that's it for me. I'm going to leave you with the animated version with the illustrated summary of the event by Katie Chappell. Thank you very much indeed, and see you soon.